Okay, let me know when you can see the slide deck.
Yep.
So we're going to talk today about SharePoint Framework, which, I gave several options, and this is what was chosen, which, I mean, you guys got some pretty advanced developers in your group, so I was a little surprised that you wanted an introduction to this. So I'll try and go a little bit beyond just straight introduction, but we'll kind of dig through this as best we can. So, as Simon said, my name's Don Kirkham. I'm an enterprise architect with a company named DMI. It's a consulting company here. I've been with the company for about 4 months now. And so really enjoying doing consulting again. I'd done consulting before. And so I've really enjoyed getting back into it. I'm a Microsoft MVP in Office development. Been a trainer, not 10 years like Sarah, but only 5 years. Have just been working in the development space after I took a short break after college to do other things that Simon kind of alluded to. And so there's all my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me at any of that stuff. If you go to my blog post, all the other stuff is on there also. So reach out, and I promise you I will respond to any of that stuff. So usually at this point I address, so what's with all the airplanes? And so like Simon kind of said, I did take a small break after college, which I majored in computer science, but decided to go do something else. So what I got to do was go fly airplanes in the Air Force. And so these are my 3 airplanes. In fact, I flew all 3 of these airplanes, and I'm in the bottom left airplane, but on the far side. So the commander was in the left side, so he wanted to be in the picture, so he got to sit on the left side. But the top one's an E3 AWACS. It's a radar plane. Doesn't have guns, so I didn't get to shoot anybody down, but I controlled all the fighters who did get to go shoot things down. So that was always fun. And then the bottom 2 are trainers, which I love doing, just teaching people how to fly. I've just loved teaching people things my whole life. So, and that bottom right one is a T-38, and that is absolutely as fun to fly as it looks like it's fun to fly. Upside down, 500 feet, 500 miles an hour. Yep, it works. So as we go into this, feel free to interrupt me at any time if there's questions or whatever. So I can't necessarily see the chat. It's over here somewhere, I think. But if you want to stop me, that's fine. So what the plan here is, I'm going to try and go through the introductory stuff fairly quickly, because my goal is to, as Simon said, I had about 3 hours, maybe, I don't know. And so we'll try and get to some more advanced topics. I'll at least show you some stuff that I've built for a workshop that kind of covers some of the more advanced stuff. But the whole idea that I usually do this session for people is to convince them that it looks a little daunting to start this, but it's really not that bad. And it's, I'll show you, 5 or 6 commands at the command line, and you can be off and running. All right, so this is what we're going to go through. I'll skip through slides as quickly as we can because I hate slides. Here's the history of SharePoint development. So we started off on-prem, on the servers. We wrote stuff that went into the server itself and was running in IIS. And every time Microsoft got a call about the SharePoint farm being down, turned out some stupid developer had done something and brought it all down. So they eventually went to the disconnected model, which is what we work with now in online, where you build what you want wherever you want, and we'll give you some access points where you can reach back to SharePoint and touch things, but you only have as much control as you have permission. And so it makes things a little bit more stable as far as things go. So SharePoint Framework, there's been talk, it depends on which week you listen to the calls on PNP, as to whether there's been talk about renaming this, because the framework has grown from just being SharePoint based to being kind of the core for a lot of stuff. Teams, you can write all your Teams app using the SharePoint framework. There's other pieces. There's a lot of stuff is going toward the Viva stuff. A lot of that is SharePoint framework compatible. And so there's talk about it being changed to something different. But for now, it's called the SharePoint framework. It is a modern technology, so it's all client-based. There's no server-side piece to it. By default, if you need server-side resources, you have to write those, deploy them yourself, and then use them. So it's all intended to run in the browser. All modern technologies, a lot of open source and stuff like that. So it's a little bit, it keeps up a little bit faster than what the old SharePoint framework stuff used to do when we were doing .NET stuff. One of the things you do need if you're gonna work with the SharePoint framework, you'll need a developer tenant. You can get one for free at that URL right there, and you can sign up for that. And they keep changing the way it works, but the current method works really well, which is as long as you do something in your tenant, which they consider to be developer type, every 2 or 3 months, it just keeps rolling over. So it used to be you could only get it for a certain amount of time, and at the end of that time, there's no way to extend it, and then so you'd lose it. So anything you put in there for demos or whatever, you'd have to go rebuild it. But now it's kind of a perpetual license. As long as you keep using it, it'll keep renewing. So sign up for one of those. The only thing you have to do is basically put an app catalog in, and you'll see later on why you'll need that. But other than that, it's a fully developed tenant that you can add personas to. It runs completely independent of everything else, so you have complete control over it, which is nice. Here's the app catalog thing I mentioned. So when we start talking about deploying our framework solutions into SharePoint or Teams or other places, app catalogs are the key. So I'll show this here in a quick demo in a minute. So the framework, what exactly is it? So this is the slide that kind of freaks everybody out. So this is like, okay, so this is all the stuff that the framework uses. Well, no, it uses way more than this. This is just kind of the normal stuff. But the bottom line is you don't have to know all this stuff. There's only a few things you kind of have to understand. But these are all things that are available. So it's very agnostic as far as you can use whatever technology you want, those web frameworks, whatever you want to use. If you're a jQuery person, you can use jQuery. If you're a Knockout person, you can use Knockout. You can do whatever you need to do. Code editors, if you like using Notepad, use Notepad. I don't know who does that, but they always say that. So it's pretty open as far as the tools that you can use to build this stuff. So if you're a .NET developer, so these are the tools that you're probably used to. So, we would build stuff, website stuff, basically, using these tools. Well, the framework uses a very similar set of tools. And once you see how they line up, it starts to make a little sense. So when you're doing development on a website, you would usually run a local version of your website in IIS using .NET and everything. The framework uses Node. Node is kind of a big hairy animal that has a whole bunch of stuff, but the bottom line is you don't have to know anything about Node. It's all done for you. It's all built for you by Microsoft as part of the framework. And it builds this little website and runs it in the background that then you get to use as part of your framework development piece. It's only for development. If you want to add things to your project, to your web part or whatever you're building in ASP.NET, you would use NuGet to add stuff. So for the framework, you would use NPM, so Node Packet Manager, or a substitution to add capabilities to your project. When you wanted to build something, you would run, we'd hit F5, MS Build would run in the background. It would compile your code, it would package it, it would minify, whatever it was doing in the background, with most of the time you didn't even know, now is handled by a product called Gulp. And Gulp is just a task runner. But again, the nice thing is you don't have to know a lot about Gulp. Microsoft has built in the task, the list of tasks that need to be run, put them into a few Gulp commands, and then you just run, Gulp serve, Gulp bundle, things like that, and it knows what to do when you run these little commands in the background. The primary language for SharePoint Framework is TypeScript. You can write it in pure JavaScript because TypeScript is JavaScript, but there's some real advantages to TypeScript. And if you're used to writing C#, you'll see a lot of parallels between that. And I'll try and, if I remember, give you kind of a quick demo. Probably the thing I love the best about TypeScript is the IntelliSense, because once you start taking your JavaScript and putting types to it, now all of a sudden when you hit the dot at the end of something, it just populates everything that's possible that you can do with that object from that point forward. And then lastly, when you wanted to create a new project in ASP.NET, you would use Visual Studio project template. So you would say project new and pick what you wanted to build and then go for that. The same thing happens with SharePoint Framework using a tool called Yeoman and a generator. So Yeoman is an open source project, and the generator is provided by Microsoft. And then it creates the project for you, and then you start editing that project in an IDE. Visual Studio Code is what I'm going to show today. You can use whatever you're comfortable with. I don't know if I've ever seen a demo in anything other than Visual Studio Code, so it seems to be kind of the go-to IDE for working with the framework. I'm not going to go through each piece here. I wanted to bring up a couple things. One of the things you'll run into is that the different versions of the framework as it moves forward, we're about to release 1.13, is dependent on a specific version of Node, since that's how this all runs. So, and you can only have one version of Node on your machine at a time. So there's a tool down there at the bottom called the Node Version Manager, which I highly, highly recommend. There's one flavor that's for the Starnix, whatever, the Linux and Apple and all that sort of, and then there's another version for Windows. They're virtually the same. The Windows one has a few different commands, but they try and keep them as much the same. But it allows you to basically install multiple versions of Node on your machine and then swap between them with a simple command line. And so that will save you a ton of, because otherwise you have to delete everything and then go reinstall Node from scratch. So I'll walk you through how that works also. The other one was the Node Packet Manager. Now, this is one that you probably will deal with more than anything else. So we talked about, NuGet is how you add things. Node Packet Manager is how you do that in the framework. And so you do end up learning quite a few commands and kind of learning how to use this tool. But the thing I bring up is at the bottom here is that there's a couple of alternatives. I love the one at the bottom called Pnpm. So when you do an npm install, so it basically goes to your project, there's a list of dependencies, and it walks through that dependency list, and then every one of those dependencies, it looks at the dependencies for that project, and then it just keeps walking that tree until it finishes. And then it downloads every single one of those projects onto your computer, into your project, and then wires them all up so that they work. It's kind of slow and it can be pretty big. Those numbers that are on there, the typical Hello World project is only 48 files and about 520 kilobytes. Once you're done with the initial install, it's 65,000 files and 500 megabytes. Now that's changed a little bit. Those numbers are a little bit old, and I think it's going to get better with version 1.13. But still, you can see the drastic difference there. So what the other alternatives did is Yarn said, well, rather than downloading that every single time, so when you create a new project and you do an npm install, it downloads everything again, even though 99% of it is exactly what you just did on the last project. So Yarn says, well, rather than downloading it again, I'm going to cache it. So I'm going to save all these files over here, keep track of what version they are. And then when you do a Yarn install, I'm going to check there first. And if I already have it, then I'm not going to re-download it. If I don't have it, then I'll download it. And then I'll copy all those files over into your project. So it's faster because it doesn't download everything, but it still ends up being the same size when you're done. The last one, Pnpm takes even one step further. So it not only caches what it downloads, but instead of actually copying everything over to your project, it uses what are called symlinks. And so it creates pointers to the packages. So the framework, that your project doesn't know the difference. It thinks that everything is in the project, but in reality, all it is a bunch of pointers. So you end up with only one version of that particular package on your computer at any given time. So it's faster and it's smaller, and we'll see how that works. So a typical npm install on a fresh project takes about 2.5 minutes. If I've done an install with the same version at some time in the past, that Pnpm one takes about 20 seconds. So it's definitely faster. All right, so here's kind of how this works. So we need to install Node and npm. npm comes with Node. Every version of Node comes with its own version of npm, so you don't have to do that separately. You have to install Yeoman, which is going to run our generator, and then you have to install the generator from Microsoft, and then you have to install Gulp, right, at the global level, and then from there you're ready to go. So that's really all you need. So it's really just 3 to 4 little things. Now I'll add a couple of little things to make things easier, like PNP, but that's all you really need. And then once you have that installed on your machine, you type in yo at Microsoft/SharePoint and answer some questions, and it builds the project for you. Now I need to update this slide because it talks about running in the local workbench. Version 1.13 got rid of the local workbench. So if you go anything previous to that, you'll see what's called a local workbench, which is completely running on your machine. Microsoft found that it was not very useful, and it was a lot of trouble to update it and keep it running. A lot of the issues they were having, because it had so many dependencies, someone would change something down the tool chain and it would break the workbench. And so they were like, nobody's really using it. We're just going to get rid of it. So now you have to use what's called a hosted workbench, which can be found in your dev tenant or any tenant. You just attach a little suffix to your page URL, and then you're in the local workbench. And now you're operating in the context of SharePoint. There's a lot of really great things for it, but you do have to tell it where that is now. So that's one extra step that's not in this slide. And then once you do that, so it's one little change you have to make, and then you hit Gulp serve, and it serves up your web part. You can see it in the browser, and then now you can start developing on it. So if you're a developer, you've seen slides like this before. So I mean, this is a typical lifecycle type slide where for the framework, client side, we're going to do the first piece is what I just talked about. We're going to install everything, and then we're going to do the second step. We're going to run that Microsoft SharePoint to scaffold the project out. We're going to open up an IDE so we can see the code and start working with it. We're going to run Gulp serve to basically serve up the web part so we can start testing it. We can look at those results in the workbench, and then we go into the little loop where we make changes, we update, we make changes, we update, we make changes, update. And we just keep going through that cycle until we're ready to ship. So as long as it's not ready to ship, we just keep going through this little circle. Very similar to other development technologies. So with that said, let's go see how this works. So I'm going to start off in Windows Terminal. Any terminal will work, that depending on what machine you have. The Windows Terminal is by far the best Windows product they've ever put out. That's a terminal. I mean, I used to use Commander, and I really liked Commander, but I've gotten where I use and like this even better. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to do a real quick look to see what version of Node I'm running. And so it shows that I think that's the same thing. Yeah, so I'm running version 14. So like I said, each version of the framework will depend on will run in different versions of Node. So the latest one will run in Node 14, which is by far the most advanced. But just to kind of start from scratch, because I've already got things installed here. So after installing NVM, all I have to do is say, I can ask it to tell me all the versions of 14, because we know we need Node version 14 is what we want to work with on this, as we start doing this version of the framework. So when it'll show those all to me. So the blue one means it's installed, but I'm not using it. The green one says that it's installed, and that's the one I'm using right now. So what I'm going to do is, since I already installed that one, let's do this. Let's install the 17 one. So I'm going to install 14. Well, I'm just going to install 14.17. And if you leave anything off in the Linux version of this, it'll just grab the latest version that's after that. So if I run this, it's going to install a new version of Node, and it's going to switch to it, which eventually creates a clean machine for me. So I'm doing this to show you that once I do this, in this command you'll get used to a lot. So one of the npm commands is you want to list everything that's in the global space, and you have to do this depth equals 0, because otherwise it'll list all the dependencies and stuff. So I just want to see the top level things that are in my global space, and the only thing that comes back is Node and npm. So there's nothing else installed right now on my machine. It's all installed somewhere else. So what I'm going to do is I'll say, okay, so let's see what else I needed. So we talked about we needed npm, and I talked about pnpm. My personal technique that I use is at the global space, I always use npm. Once I get into the project, I'll use pnpm. But at the global space, I just find it easier to stick to npm. It's only a couple items, so the slowness doesn't bother me near as much. So I'm going to basically say I'm going to install some stuff here. So the things I need to install, I know I need to install Gulp, and I know I need to install Yeoman, and I'm going to go ahead and install Pnpm. And then I usually will install what's called the PNP Microsoft 365 CLI. I'm going to skip that for now, but because I don't have time to demo it, but it's a great little tool for doing some stuff. It's like PowerShell. It's just a different way of doing it. They wrote it because PowerShell wasn't available at the time on Linux machines, and so they wrote this. Now PowerShell can be run core can be run across the different things. So I'm going to go ahead and start this because it will take a little bit of time for it to download everything. So you can watch it. It'll just sit here, going down and downloading everything as we go through. But while it's doing that, I'm going to jump over and open up another terminal. And what I'm going to do is I want to check to see, I want to do an npm show, and I want to look at that Microsoft, the SharePoint framework. Type and talk at the same time. Nope. Where am I? Yes. So when you're doing the installs for the generator, you have to use the word generator, but once you get it installed, then you don't. I cannot generator. So if you run this npm show command, it kind of will go out and find the SharePoint Yeoman generator for the framework and tell you some details about it. The thing that I'm really looking for is these tags down here at the bottom. So when I do an install, if I don't give it any suffix, if I don't tell it what version I want, it's going to always install the latest. Okay, so that would be 112.1. I want next, which is 113, and then release candidate 1, because that's going to be coming out here anytime. But I can also, if I type versions at the end here, you can see all the versions that are available. So sometimes we talk about the PNP stuff and samples and stuff. They are in older versions. If you're doing on-prem stuff, I don't remember the exact version off the top of my head, but you have to go way back to like 1.4.1 in order to do some stuff. And so you have to kind of really know which versions you're working with. The cloud, you can pretty much always use the latest version. So that kind of shows what's available. Let me go see over here and see what we did. So it looks like everything installed correctly for us. So all I need is that last thing. So I'm going to do the npm install at the global spot and then the @Microsoft. I think I did better that time. And then I'm going to do at the next because I want to install the 1.13. And I did something wrong. npm. Did I misspell it? Generate Microsoft. Oh, I know. It's Microsoft / generator - SharePoint. Sorry. Let's try that. Okay, so it's going to install that. And then, like I said, once we get to that part, we're ready to start building stuff. So even though I showed you some extra commands, once you kind of understand what's going on, like I said, I could have put this Microsoft generator SharePoint at the end of the previous line I ran. I could have installed them all in one command, and then once it's done, be ready to go. Trying to remember how long this one takes. This one's a little bit bigger, so it takes a little bit longer. What you'll see when you start installing stuff, you'll see a lot of these warnings. We don't worry about them. It usually has something to do somewhere down in the dependency chain. Something's been deprecated, but have yet to find anything that is a security issue or anything like that. If there's an error, it'll throw an error and it'll stop. But for the most part, you can just ignore the warnings. A lot of this stuff isn't used. It's just the fact, like I said, as it walks that dependency tree, it loads everything. So even if it's not used, it's still going to try and load it. While that's finishing, I'm going to run back over here and see where I am. So I'm in my code. I like just to create a thing for code. Now I'm running this on WSL, so Windows Subsystem for Linux, because it's much faster than running it off the straight Windows operating system, which makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to go to demos and then see what's in here. So not much. So I'm going to create a directory, and we'll just call this leads 1. All right, so now I've created the directory, so now we just need to wait for this to finish over here. Okay, so it's there. So now I'm just going to change over to that. So I'm just trying to save a little bit of time here. So I'm going to change this to leads 1. Oops. Okay, so in here, there's nothing. Okay, it's just an empty directory. So now we're gonna create our first project. So as I said before, we're gonna do yo at Microsoft SharePoint. And that's all we need to do. Now, what I'm going to do just for demo purposes is, and I like to do this anyway, because in order to use PNP, if you don't put anything here, it will scaffold out your project, and then it will run npm install on the project, unless there's another command line you can do to tell it to use pnpm. But I'm just going to tell it to skip the install altogether. So it's just going to create the project, but it's not going to do the initial install. I'll do that manually here in a second. So it walks through, I get a nice confirmation that I'm in the right version, asks for my solution name. It likes to pick one for you based on the folder that you're in, but it puts the dash in there and I don't like it. So I'm going to skip that. So with the latest version of the framework, it used to have the option where you could use this to build stuff for on-prem also. They've decided to decouple them because it was just getting really hard to keep it all in the same solution. So just like the little line says there, if you're using on-prem for 2016 or 2019, then go back to the previous version of the generator and use that. So this is only going to be valid for SharePoint Online. It gives you the option to create a folder or use the current folder. If you create a folder, it will take the solution name that you gave it above, and it'll try and create a folder with that solution name, but it'll add that dash back in there. So I don't like that. A couple of options it's going to give you here. It basically gives you the option to tell when you deploy this to allow the admin who's deploying this to deploy this web part across the entire tenant at once, just by clicking a button. And I'm going to say yes for that. There's pros and cons. I won't go into all that, but I'm just going to say yes for now. This one's a more advanced thing about using Access Web APIs, so we're going to skip that. So here's the things you can build. So you can do web parts. You can do extensions. There's several different types. There's application customizers. There's which is things that it's a piece of JavaScript that basically gets run on every single page. There's field customizers where you can change how a field is displayed or works in a list kind of thing. Custom list formatting is kind of reduced the need for that one as much unless it really gets complex. Trying to remember the third one. There's a third one where you can actually add menus and stuff into the different toolbars, and I can't remember what that one's called off the top of my head right now. You can build a library. So if you have some code that you use in a whole bunch of web parts, you can just put it in its own little library and then just refer to it. And that way you don't have to keep bundling it with every single one. And then when you need to update it, you have to update every single web part that you've updated the bundle in. So you can do that through a library. And this is new for this version, the adaptive card extension. I haven't even played with this yet, but you'll be able to develop adaptive card extension solutions for Viva specifically using the SharePoint framework. We're going to stick to the web part because it's just the easiest, and we'll go from there. So we start off with, hello world is what they always want. So I'm just going to change it a little bit just so we can see the difference. Even though you're doing a web part, do not put the word web part in your web part name, and I'll show you why in a minute. You can do no JavaScript framework or React. Those are the only two options that are in the framework by default. You can add any other framework you want manually, but these are the ones that are provided for you. I decided a long time ago that Microsoft uses React to build all of the SharePoint stuff, so I was going to learn to use it too. So I pretty much always use React, just for no other reason because it's there. And there you go. That's it. As soon as I answered the last question, it took that long to build the project out. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and open the project up in code. And we'll take a look at it. And while we're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and open up the terminal here. First, I want to turn this on, the screencast mode, so you can see what I type, especially like the control keys and stuff. I guess this is when I was doing it earlier. Remember what I had open. So here's our solution over here on the right. So I opened up the terminal, which you can do that from Visual Studio Code just by doing Control and the backtick, and that opens that up. And then it opens it in the right folder and everything, which is awesome. And then I'm going to go ahead and run the Pnpm install. Okay, and we'll let that run while we talk about some stuff, but it won't take long. It'll be done here in just a second. So I want to look at the project and see what this builds for us. So a lot of stuff in here, and we don't have time to go through all of it. It's interesting to go through all of it and see what else built, but I'll cover the important pieces. The package.json file is where all those dependencies I talked about are listed, and they're divided into 2 sections. So there's, and you can see PNP's done, 20 seconds it's done, not 2.5 minutes. So I had a computer before, based on the internet connection I had at work, it took 12 minutes to do an npm install. So I get really excited when I start to see, sub-minute installs on these things. So anyway, back to the dependencies. So you have dependencies and dev dependencies. So dependencies are things that your web part needs in order to run in SharePoint. So once I deploy this into SharePoint, these are the things that need to be included with my project in order to run. Some of these are not really included. The SharePoint core stuff is actually available already in SharePoint, but it needs to know which version it's using. So it's React. It's the Fabric, which is actually called Fluent UI now. They just haven't changed the name. And then the SharePoint Framework core pieces. These 5 pieces. I'm sorry, those 4. The bottom one is actually React also. The dev dependencies are the things that I need in order to run the tool chain, to run Gulp. You see Gulp down there. To run Webpack, which does my bundling. To run TypeScript. So there's the Rush Stack compiler. That's the TypeScript compiler. There's the TS-lint rules. So these are all things you just need for the development part of it, but you don't need these, in the actual project. So when you start adding pieces, that's the question you have to ask. Am I adding this because I need it in my project? So like I'm going to be working with dates or time. So Moment.js, even though they say it's deprecated, it's still one of the better ones out there. I need that in my project, not in my dev dependency. So I need to put it, when I add it, I need to add it as a regular dependency, not a dev dependency. If you do some fancy stuff with fast compiles and stuff like that, those will get added into the dev dependencies. All right, so up here, I'll come back to config here in a second, but really the main part of the project is right here in the SRC folder. So this is where, and you can, if I went back and ran the Yo generator again, I could add another web part. I could add an extension here. I could add, you can have multiple things inside the solution. So they all get added in here. So under web parts, it would have all my web parts listed. So it created hello leads, and then it listed the stuff that's in here. So remember I said, don't use the word web part in your title because it's going to add web part for you. So if you said it was the hello leads web part, this would now say the hello leads web part. So, and that, trust me, I've done it, and it gets really annoying really fast. And not only is the file name that way, but it actually names the class inside this the same thing, and the properties. So you just end up with web part everywhere. So it's a pain. So just name it what it is and go from there. So this file here is what I call the root of the web part. So this is the shell of how the SharePoint framework works. And then because we're using React, we're going to put the React component inside the shell. So I use the analogy, it's like a basket with apples in it, okay? This is the basket, and then the apples is the thing that goes in it. So they're 2 separate things, even though Microsoft is very great about naming everything, so it looks like it's all related and somehow the naming conventions matter. The naming conventions do not matter at all. You can rename these things anything you want. But when we talk about properties, that basket apple thing will start to come into more focus. So the standard SharePoint file, the TypeScript file, what you typically find is a bunch of import statements at the top. And usually, the ones at the top are kind of the core things. So these are all things that are all coming from the core, those core libraries that we saw in the dependencies. And these are the things that again, this is all done for me. I haven't touched anything. This is all being done for me by Microsoft when they scaffold the project. And then there's a section that basically imports things that are elsewhere in the project. So there's a thing called strings, which helps you do the multilingual thing. So if you look over here in this localizer, this local folder, you can see there's a class here called mystrings, and then there's an English version. So if you wanted multiple versions, you just create a Spanish prefix.js, and then you would put all the Spanish strings in there. So we're importing that. And then the last 2 we're importing is the React piece. So the React component that we're going to build is called hello leads, and it uses properties called iHello leads properties. So those are both coming from up here in this components folder, which we'll look at here in a minute. So that's pretty standard. And then you go from there into the rest of the code. So this property right here, the iHelloLeads web part property is the web part property. So this is the properties of the basket. So if I want to be able to go into the properties panel on the page and change things about my web part, this is where this happens. You have to put them in here and then refer to them in the panel so that it can update them. But it's different from the properties we'll look at on the React component because they could be completely different depending on what you're trying to do. All the projects inherit from this base client-side web part, and then they name it whatever you told it to name it, and then it's using those web part properties that we just looked up here. So it's basically saying I need a web part using these properties, and that creates that class. There's a few methods that are in here. The most important one is the render method. When you get into more advanced things, you'll have an on a init. I think it's on a init, maybe just a init. Where you'll initialize some things, but really the render one is where you actually figure out what your web part is going to do. And in this particular case, we're doing React. So we're basically going to create a React element using the React properties. This is from the React properties. And we're going to create that, and we're going to use this class, which we're going to look at in a minute to build it. And we're going to pass in this case, we're going to go ahead and pass that description in. So it's a web part property that we're going to pass into the component. So it now is going to be a React property also. And that's common, but again, it's not required. I don't know how many sample projects I've seen where nobody takes the description out. If you're not using it, just take it out. You don't need it anymore, but people leave it in there. Once we build the element, then we're basically going to say, take that element we just built and stick it into the DOM element for the web part. So in other words, we're replacing the content of the current web part with whatever we built in React. That's the core of how the React stuff works. A couple of these don't really make any difference. Here's that property pane piece. So the property pane in SharePoint Framework is always React-based. Whether you choose React or you choose any other framework, Microsoft uses React to build the property panel. So what you end up doing is you don't have a ton of control over what goes on over there. There are ways you can get control, but by default you don't. So you just end up passing in a property, an object, which has a collection of pages, and each page has a header and a description, and there's groups in there, and then there's fields inside the group. So in this particular one, we'll see there's just one text field, and it's tied to the description property that we saw above, and we're using a string out of the string components over here for that label. You don't need to do that. A lot of times, if I'm not planning on anything other than English, I just take this part out and I just start typing my own strings in there. So it's kind of the lazy man's way of doing it. It's kind of short-sighted, but until I get to the point where I'm really starting to do multi-language stuff, it's much faster than trying to, because every time you add one of these, you have to go over here, you have to add it in 2 different places. In fact, if you have multiple languages, you have to add it in every language that you have in order to make it work. So, but it's again, it's just decoration. You don't have to use it. You can substitute with your own thing. Okay, the component. All right, so here's the pieces for the React component. So this was the properties, and again, in this particular case, it's the same properties we have on the basket that we have inside the React component, but that's just the way it worked out. This is the actual React component, and then this last piece here is the CSS, it's Sass, that you use to style out your React component. So real quick on this, so if you look at the React component, you see a similar type pattern where they have import statements at the top, and then it starts talking about the React components. We define it using the React component properties. This little empty brace is for what's called state, which we're not going to talk about today, but that's where you can basically start watching when things change in the web part. It redraws the web part. So that's how you get some animation or just things change. When we look at the more advanced solution, that'll make more sense. And then you do this return, and you return, or you build out what I call it's pseudo HTML. So it looks like HTML, but there's some little subtle differences. And if you look at it, it's actually just an object. It's just one object with sub-objects in it. The first thing you notice is we can't use the word class like we do in HTML, because class is a reserved word in TypeScript. So it would confuse things. So you always use class name. And then you can basically inject anywhere in here any kind of code. So you put it in between the braces, and you can put in variables. You can put in formulas. You can say if this, then return that. If otherwise, return this. and it can get really advanced as you go through this. Other than that, the rest of this is very similar. I mean, here's a link down here. So it's got an href, it's got the class, spans. So very similar. They provide by default this little piece here where they display the description that's in the property. Because you can edit that in the property pane, they always recommend that you put this inside of a function called escape, which you get up here by default, to keep people from trying to inject things onto your page that do nasty things. And then lastly, we'll look at the CSS. And again, I call this pseudo CSS because it's actually Sass. So what it does is it imports from Fabric UI or Fluent UI all the information. And then it looks a whole lot like CSS, although you've got this ability to nest things together. And so typically you find one class that matches the name of your web part, and then everything else is inside of that. And that helps isolate your CSS to only be in your web part. So the last thing you want is for your CSS to reach out and change something on the page that you didn't intend for it to do. And there's some ways it does that using some identifiers and stuff like that. But for the most part, this looks like pretty standard CSS until you get down into this part. So when you look at the includes, those work very similar to imports. So up here, there are classes that have been defined for grid row and font color white. And you're basically saying just use them. So use the ones that come from the Fabric UI. It also gives you some variables. So you can use this variable here instead of setting the color yourself. You can use the theme color. It'll pass that in for you. And then as you start going down here, you start to see things. If you're familiar with Bootstrap, you start to see some Bootstrap type things where you've got columns, standard 12 column grid. So if it's the screen size is large, we're gonna skip one and then do 10. If it's extra large, then we're gonna do 8 and skip 2. So it just starts doing that Bootstrap type grid thing on the page. And then I won't cover the rest of these because it's pretty much all the same thing. So what happens is when we do this gulp serve, is it's going to take this and it's going to convert it effectively into JavaScript and then make that as part of the project. So the last thing I need to do before I do this, because again, I haven't touched anything. Remember, we're just talking about what's in here, but I haven't actually touched anything. I need to go up here and look at this serve.json. So since we don't have a local workbench anymore, then this is where I have to tell it where my dev tenant or whatever tenant I want to test this in. This is where the information goes for that. So I'm going to put my dev tenant in here. And I'm just going to put at the root for that and then save it. And then that's the only change I have to make. All right. So now when I type gulp serve, last thing I'm going to do before I do that is I'm going to go grab, because it will open up basically the last browser you had open, the last browser profile you had open. So, so I want to make sure that I'm in my dev tenant. So this is my dev tenant. It's just a standard SharePoint tenant. Then it's got a few sites in it. We're going to play around in the home today for the most part. We talked about that app catalog before. The way you do that is you go into more features and you go to apps. If you don't have an app catalog defined, then I don't remember if it happens on this screen or it happens on this screen. It will basically say, you don't have an app catalog. Would you like to create one? You say yes, it creates it for you. From that point forward, it takes you into the app catalog. So this apps for SharePoint, this is where we're going to go deploy everything once we get to that step. Okay, so you see I have a couple things already in here. All right, so I'm going to go back here and make sure that this is active before I hit the gulp serve. And so what you'll see is now it's going to start going through, and let me go back here, maximize this, and we can see what it's doing. So gulp remembers that task runner. So it knows when you say serve, it knows there's a list of things it has to accomplish. So it starts going through and doing that. So you can see some of the steps it does, copying some stuff around, finding the static assets. Here's the Sass where it's starting to take that Sass and make sure that that's all valid and putting it into CSS or whatever it uses. It's not actually CSS. Lint is checking the TypeScript to make sure it's valid. The TSC is the compiler. So you can see it just walks through all of this stuff until it gets to the end. When it gets to reload, that means the site is ready. Now, what you'll notice here is there's a request that came in right here before it's ready. So when I go over here and look at my thing, I'm going to get this little ugly warning that says, hey, Gulp server's not running yet. Well, it's running. It just wasn't running at the time that this page opened up. So if you just close that out and refresh it, then everything's good. It's just the fact that it's gotten it's so fast that it actually requests the stuff before it's actually ready. This is called the hosted workbench. So if you take this layouts, you don't even need the 15. The layouts /workbench.aspx and append that to any URL in your SharePoint tenant, you'll get the workbench for that site. And so from there, it's just a little mini workbench. It doesn't have all the other stuff. It's it's a little bit limiting, but you know, it works. So we're going to go down. It's always at the bottom. We're going to go find our web part. So there's Hello Leads. That's the one we created. And we're going to throw it in there. And just like that, there's our web part. So I've done a lot of talking and wasted a lot of time, but ultimately, if you compiled all that down, we could have been from installing a version of Node to this being visible on the screen in less than about 3 minutes. So it really does kind of go fast. It's a fully functional web part. If you open the panel up, remember we talked about all the stuff we looked at in the panel. You know, this is the page name, this is the page description, this is the group name, the strings that they define, just, you know, kind of tell you what they are. And then we use this one field in here, and this field by default is reactive. So as I type in this, you can see over in the web part, it's updating. So that's the default behavior. Sometimes that doesn't work real well when you have some sort of a nesting, you know, kind of thing where, you know, I need to define 3 or 4 nested drop downs before I get everything I need in order to make this work. There is an option you can turn this part off and just give you a nice little apply button at the bottom. And once you're done, you just hit apply and it goes over. The other thing that's nice about this is it's a little bit more difficult to do on a single screen. But if I go back into the code again, and I go find my React web part, and I'm like, and I just change this to something else. When I save it, if you watch down here at the bottom, you can see it starts building it again. So it's listening for any changes that you make to the code, and then it immediately goes in and tries to update your code. So you have to wait till it gets to the reload statement before it's ready. And then you can go back over, and as soon as I refresh this, you can see that the updated thing that I just put in there. So if you're working on multiple screens, this is great. You have this on one screen, you have your code on the other screen, so you can quickly go back and forth and start messing with your code and finding out what you want to do. And so we just keep doing that until we're ready for the next step. Let me do it that way. Okay, there we go. All right, so we looked at this before. So we were in the first loop before. So we were in the development loop. So what happens when I get to the part where now my answer for am I ready to ship this is yes. So there's just a couple of steps that you need to run. So we need to actually optimize everything up and bundle it, and then package it all together so that we can put it into SharePoint and SharePoint can use it. So there's a few commands, and so this is kind of the gist of it. Build, we don't actually run a build when you run bundle, it runs build for you. We've been running build. When you run serve, you get the build command comes with that. So we're pretty much confident at this point that build is going to work. Bundle is just going to take all of our stuff, optimize it. When we do the -- ship, we're basically telling it this is a production deployment, not a dev deployment. You can do a dev deployment. In certain cases, that's valuable, but for the most part, you're just going to do a -- ship. So it generates the manifest, it adds stuff into the project, so you'll see some extra folders that will start to show up. And then once that's done, you'll do a package solution, which takes everything that Bundle did and pushes it all into one zip file, changes the extension to SPPKG, and then makes that available for you to put into SharePoint so you can have your web part available. So we talked about app catalogs. There's 2 app catalogs. I showed you the tenant scoped app catalog. You can also create a site collection scoped app catalog. And the last I checked, you can only do that using PowerShell, but maybe you don't want this web part available for everybody in the tenant. It's something very specifically built for this one site. You can create a site collection app catalog, deploy it just there, and then it's only available on that one site. So those are your 2 options for deployment. And then by default, SharePoint takes all the files you need for your web part and puts them all in that package file. It didn't used to be that way. It used to be you had to figure out where to put all those files yourself. But now it gets deployed into a special place into SharePoint that SharePoint knows about. So when you drop this package file into the app catalog, it looks in the manifest and it says, oh, it says the client assets are here. So I'll grab all those. I'll go put them over here in this special library. And then, I'll wire everything up and we're all good. You don't have to do that. You can say, you know what, I want all my code to be hosted somewhere else. One of the use cases I've seen for this is if I have a friend that has a product for his company and it's a bunch of web parts. And he was like, every time we update the web part, we don't want to have to redeploy it to every one of our clients. There's hundreds, maybe thousands of clients we would have to redeploy this to. So what he did is they broke that out. So the code is actually stored in a CDN that they have complete control over, and they just deploy the manifest. So every time they update the code, the solution gets updated. So it is possible to do that. So you put this wherever you want to, and then in the manifest, you tell it, this is where all my files are. All right. We don't need this anymore. Let's go back to our project. Okay, we'll see out of this because we're not going to run this anymore. We're ready to start packaging this up. Everything looks pretty good. So let me, I'm going to run the Gulp Bundle. This one takes just a second because it has to go through that same build chain. That's what takes the most time. We're going to do a Gulp package solution. And these seem like it's a lot. When I first saw these commands, because I used to be a command line jockey, and then IDE spoiled me. And then I saw this all show up back in. I'm like, oh, I got to remember all these commands. Trust me, you do this 2 projects in, you'll remember all these commands by heart. It'll be easy. So what's happened now is I talked about the extra folders that start to show up over here. So as it's doing those 2 commands, it's starting to build extra things. And one of the things it builds is this SharePoint solution folder that has this package right here in it. And that's the package that we want to deploy into SharePoint. Now, if you're in Windows, you can just drag and drop this, but because I'm actually in WSL, I have to take one extra step. So I'm just going to basically tell it to open up the File Explorer, and I'll go get the file from there. So here's that same file, just in the File Explorer. Now what I'm going to do is go back to my dev tenant. Here's my app catalog. And all I'm going to do is just drag and drop it. I'm going to drop it in here. It's going to ask me a couple things. One, it's going to ask me about trusting. So this is your standard trust dialog that you get. The thing I really tell people about this, I honestly have no idea what this says up in the top. I've never really read it, but I'm curious about this piece, because if you don't use the -- ship, it's going to say localhost, which means it's looking for the files on your local host, which is not what we want. I don't need my local host to be running in order to make this to work. So it needs to say SharePoint Online. If you put it in a separate CDN, I don't remember what it says up here. It's been so long since I did it that way. So I want to make sure this says SharePoint Online, so I know that all my assets have gone with the solution. And then this is that box that the admin can check to say, hey, make this available for all the sites at one time without having to go through the feature framework and adding it and then making it available. So this is a real easy way to deploy something across the entire tenant. So what I'll do is I'll watch over here. So everything looks good. So no problems, no errors. It did deploy it to the entire tenant. So now I can go back to a site. So this is one of my dev sites. I took a site, created a page that has all the different iterations of column widths. So I have a full width, and then I have half widths and third widths. And so I can play with my web parts at different sizes, and I can put them side by side to each other and see them. So it's just kind of a nice way to be able to see stuff off the bat. All right, so I'm going to go back down, find my Hello Leads web part again. Okay, and there we are. It's there. So we have the property pane again. I go back over to Visual Studio real quick. Nothing's running over here. So this is all code that's running in SharePoint right now. So I've now fully deployed my my web part to the piece. Now, one of the things that, now let's see, I don't think I did it. So I'll show that part in the next piece. So that's it. That's your first web part from start to finish. So we doing on time here. Can I go till half past, or what do you guys say? What do you guys say? You use something half. You
Go for it. Half past. Yeah.
Okay. Are we good till half past? Do I have that much time, or do we need to go?
Carry on. Keep going.
Okay. Okay. So the next piece I really will push is PNP. So, and I know we've got people on the call that are part of PNP. I know Simon is. I think Dylan might be part of this, but Paul Bullock I know is part of this group. I never can remember his name off the top of my head. Anyway, big people in the patterns and practicing. If you're going to do SharePoint development, and there's more than just development in here. Again, I know Simon works on the maturity model, which is awesome. There's samples for lists, for custom list formatting. The adaptive card stuff is in here. So there's a lot of stuff in here. If you're not using this, then honestly, I don't want to talk to you. You're making your life miserable if you're not using this. This is this is the fast lane. This is the Formula One lane of development. If you want to be over in the slow lane with your blinker on, then you can do that. But that means you have to build it all from scratch. This will jumpstart so many things. Almost everything I do, I go here and look first to see, has someone already done that? Or at least come close, and I can grab that, put it into my code, tweak it to what I need, and then I'm up and running in a matter of minutes or hours versus days or weeks. The little URL at the bottom is how you get to it. The next slide just has basically some of the stuff that you have, but there's so much cool stuff on this site. So the first two columns talk about videos. There's a couple different video libraries on YouTube that have all kinds of tutorials on how to do different pieces, not only what I just showed, but how to build this kind of web part, or how to connect to this kind of data source. All the adaptive card stuff is being built up as we talk. The middle one, there's everything is open source, so there's GitHub repositories for all of this stuff. So you can go and actually look at actual code that other people have written and use it in your own stuff. It's all free, doesn't cost you anything. If anything, the only ask is, hey, if you get a chance, maybe contribute back. If you come up with something cool, maybe look into giving back. There's tons of samples. There's thousands of samples that are in these different galleries that you can go look at. So there's no reason to try and do stuff by yourself before you go look and see if someone else has already kind of paved the way for you. So again, that URL gets you into all of it. There's a program that's not on this slide called Sharing is Caring. So if you're a little nervous about the whole thing, it's a program just for beginners. So you go in there, they have several webinars that you can go to that are all free. All of this is completely free. It's basically managed by Microsoft, but it's mostly community. A lot of Microsoft people are in it, but it's a lot of MVPs and other community folks that contribute to this and of their own time and for nothing. The other thing, sharing is caring. So sharing is caring will get you started. So there's, you can learn how to be a first-time contributor. So one of the things you can do in here that opens up the doors. So if you find a typo in the Microsoft, in the documentation, you can edit it yourself and then submit a pull request, and then it gets picked up, and Microsoft, they check it out what you corrected and say, oh, yep, you're right. We misspelled, markdown or something like that, and they fix it. I did that last week on something, and so easy to get started and really great people that will help you do that. So I won't beat that drum anymore, but I can't beat it enough. It's really, really important. Okay. That's the beginner presentation. So what I thought I'd do, if we have the time, is go look at something that's a little bit more complex. So I do a workshop on the SharePoint, and in the workshop, we build out a web part, application customizer, and we show how this can be used in Teams. So I'll kind of show you how that works. Although as I'm looking at this, for some reason my application customizer is not showing up. That's really strange. Interesting. All right, I'll go back. So here's the web part. So I took a list. So just upcoming speaking events. So I just put in my upcoming speaking events and my vacation time that's coming up that I'm excited about. I just threw in a list just so we have something to work with. And then we built a web part to kind of show those in kind of a card. I think I'm going to go back and rebuild this using adaptive cards. But when I built this, those really weren't mature enough to use them. But I just grab all the data, put it into a standard card. Oh, I know why it's not showing up. Somehow the time has gone past. Let me fix it real quick. I think it has something to do with we've gone past the time. So let me change our. We'll just change this till tomorrow. So we'll say that I'm speaking tomorrow with you guys. See if that happens. There we go. So if it gets within 7 days, then I turn the little bubble red, and then I add this little banner at the top. And this little banner is the top of every single page. So if you go and look at the list or whatever, it's up there. So it's just a nice reminder. That's an application customizer that gets added into the thing. But this web part is set that it's pulling data from the list. It's one way. It's only read only right now. I might update it at some point in the future. But it's got a little more advanced on the properties. I create a second page for advanced settings because in the workshop I cover how to do the data interaction both using the Pnpm, which is an awesome library for doing interaction with any SharePoint data or the graph, or just doing straight REST calls. So you can switch back and forth between the two. It doesn't really do anything visually because of some caching that happens, but the code is there for both. And what I'll do is I'm just going to delete this real quick and show you how this works. So, and I'll show you the pieces that I built versus what I took from somewhere else. So this is called the speaking demo. So the first thing that happens is when you create a new web part on the page, it's not configured. So you get this nice little pretty thing that says, hey, you need to configure the web part, push the little button. This is all PNP. This is just lifted straight off of PNP. It's a part that you can import, and it says basically if you haven't met the requirements for configuration, then display this. And then you open it up, and what I wanted to do is I wanted to use the same list from anywhere in the tenant. So first thing I need to do is identify where that list is going to be. So again, this property pane control is PNP. So I just lifted this, I just imported it and used it. And then I took the results of that when I select home and passed it. So if I unselect home, you can see that the list is grayed out because I can't give you a list of lists until I know which site I'm going to use. So once I select that, now I have this, and it actually goes through and it populates this for me. Again, this is out of PNP. All of this is out of PNP. This little control here for how many events get displayed is straight out of PNP. So I didn't have to build any of this. I just did imports and then dropped it onto the into the object for the property panel. Everything is, it's reactive, so, as you move around and everything, everything adjusts. So it works really well. So that's the web part. The extension, like I said, is pretty straightforward. It just checks to see is anything within 7 days, and if so, it displays this red banner with the little, this is what is coming up in the next 7 days. The other thing this will do, and this is there's a couple different ways of doing Teams development using the framework. One of the ways is if you do the framework web part first, then you can just, by including a couple of things in the project manifest, then you can use this in Teams. So what happens is, here's my component. When I drop it in here, there's these options up here at the top, and one of them is sync to Teams. So I've already done this, and so it takes and it basically wires up this web part so that I can use it in Teams. So if I open up Teams and I go in here and I say I want it to, I can do it as a personal app also. Here's my speaking demo. But the problem with personal apps is there's no property pane, so you have to do properties a different way. So I'm just going to do it as a tab. So same sort of thing. It opens up the tabs. It says, yep, here's that speaking demo that you wanted. I say, yes, go ahead and add that to my team. And sure enough, I get exactly what we're just looking at. Oh, yep, I need to configure this. So let me search, pick my site, pick my list, pick however many events I want, close it out. And so now I have that exact same web part is now displayed as a tab in Teams. That easy. I did nothing other than change one thing in the project. And actually I think the new framework actually does this by default for you. You don't even have to add it. I think it puts the piece of code you need in here for you. So now there's some other quirks to doing it this way, but for the most part, it's not that difficult to do. Everyone thinks it's very difficult, but Teams has its own authentication piece, but it kind of figures that all out for you. Okay, so what does that look like? So let's go look real quick at the code that makes all that work. So let's close this one out. So this is the project that does that. So there's a lot of stuff in here that helps demonstrate some of the stuff that I talked about earlier. So inside my project, inside the source folder, I have a folder for extensions and for web parts. So I have the extension and the web part all in the same project, or all in the same solution. And it handles that just fine, no problems at all. Because we're working with data, there's different patterns. This is all technique or whatever, but I like to pull all the data stuff into services. So I have a PnP service and then I have a REST service. So all the code for interacting with the list is all in here. And then because those services use the same data models, I pull the models out. A lot of times I leave the models in the service rather than create a whole nother file, but it makes more sense in this particular case that, the service only has one function. So, and then the function basically returns this by event data, which is a list of events and an error message if there's an error message, and then I can check for that and display it if needed. And then so it's an array of I events. So that's the models that it does. So real quick, the Teams thing. So in the config.json, is that where it is? Always have to remember where it is. Nope, it's down here. It's in the manifest. So this is the manifest file for the web part. So in here, nope, that's not the right one. This one is the web part. So in here, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I use. So the thing that we're interested in is the supported host. This tells SharePoint where my web part can be used. Okay, so it can be used as just a web part. It can be used as a Teams tab, which I demoed. It can be used as a full page app, so you can actually add this so that it takes up the entire page, or it can be used as a Teams personal app. The other thing that the next line does, supports full bleed. Actually, you add that in there, and what that supports is when I come over to a page that has it on there, if I add in the full width section. So again, this web part down here is limited to the standard SharePoint width, 700 and something pixels or something, I don't know. But sometimes it's like all that white space. I know they say that's good, but sometimes it's like I can't afford all that white space. So you can put it in here, and now my web part takes up, can take up the whole page from one side to the other. So that was and again, all I had to do to make this work is just change that one little piece in the manifest. All right, so you can see it goes all the way from one side to the other versus being inside this more traditional box. When you have properties, so when we look at the properties for this particular web part. So I needed to know the site, the list, the service source, which is whether it's PnP or REST, the number of events to display, and then the title that I want it to display in the web part itself. That is actually a PnP piece also. So those are the 5 things that I need to get from that property pane. So if we go down and look at the property pane, you can see how that works out. So here's the site. So again, this property field site picker comes from PnP. The property field list picker comes from PnP. The field spin button comes from PNP. So the property pane dropdown, that's actually just out of the box one. But everything else came from PNP. So all I had to do is you just go to the site, you find the information, you put in the import statements at the top. There's usually sample code that you can copy, paste in there, and then, like I said, configure it for what you want. Just trying to think what other important things are in here. So this one, so here's that on a knit piece. So before, when we use the basic one, we were just doing render, but sometimes you need to initialize some things before you get to the render piece. So in this particular case, I initialize the REST service, and I do this is the code to set up the PNP.js piece. So let me show you real quick the value of TypeScript. Because this is all typed, so this is the web part. That represents the entire web part. As soon as I hit the dot, I get a whole bunch of properties that I can get from the web part. So I can tell, is it in what display mode is it? Is it in edit mode, or is it in regular full display mode? The DOM element, that's the actual DOM element that holds the web part that we replace with the React component. If you put a description in the web part, it's there. I'm trying to think what other. The title, the width, you can get all that information just by asking for it. The other thing you get, this is probably the coolest, is you get this context. Context, because your web part is running on a page, the code already knows a whole lot of stuff because you have to be logged in, right? You have to be logged in to get to the page. So there's all kinds of things that you can get from there. So here they are. So you can have a factory that's an active Azure Active Directory HTTP client. So you can make calls to Azure Active Directory. If you set up a token factory, it's more of a Teams thing, but you can set up a factory there. You can set up a straight HTTP client, not click. You can set up a client factory for the graph, so you can access the graph, and all you do is you click on this and then get client, and then there's a couple of other pieces you got to do, but now all of a sudden you have access to the graph, whatever the current user has. And remember, there's no elevated privileges in SharePoint Framework. You can't have anything more than what the user that's logged in has without going to something that's not SharePoint Framework, like an API in the background running on a server or something like that. Okay, so but there's so much cool stuff that you get in here, and it basically tells you things. It's great for if you mess up, it tells you what it is, and a lot of times this one doesn't have any quick fixes, but a lot of times if you type things in, it'll search and it'll find, oh, you need a reference and import statement for something, and it'll tell you what it is, and you just say, yep, do that, and it puts it in there. So lots of little pieces. I talked about the reactive mode for the property pane. If you just uncomment this, then it no longer is reactive, and it gives you the apply button. So it's just that simple to do that piece. Here's a little bit of code because I'm doing a nested property pane, so I have to pick the site first and then do the list. So basically it says, hey, when the site changes, then check to make sure, yep, it's the site property path, and there is a new value. Then set the new value, make the list null, and then run the whole thing through, and then refresh the thing. So now it refreshes, but now it has a site assigned to it. So now the next one down knows that it can go ahead and populate the number of lists that are in the site. Let's see, what else is in here? The application customizer is also React based. So I didn't really need to. It's really simple. I mean, I could have easily done this as a JavaScript only component, but I just like playing with React, just trying to learn the different pieces of it. Trying to think if there's anything else that was major in here that I was going to kind of demo, just to kind of show you that these are, a little bit more advanced. I know what I'll do. I'll show the, when we go to the web part and we start looking in here. So inside the web part, so this is React. So again, a bunch of import statements to the top, lots of properties. Okay, so some of these properties are the same ones that we pulled in for so on the basket on the web part. Some of them aren't. So the open property pane, this is a method. So I'm basically passing this back to the web part to tell it, hey, open the property pane. And then the same thing with the update property, it does that. So for the most part, these properties are pretty similar to the ones before. Here's what we were talking about with state. So anything I put inside the state, which that looks very familiar, the events and the error from that iData model that we used before, every time something changes in here, it redraws the web part super, super fast. It's all done in memory. So all I have to do to update the web part is change one of these things, and it will automatically update the web part. So if you know, every time I change the number of events or whatever, it updates that stuff. When we get down into the React component, so I have a little constructor where I basically you're going to basically set that state, the initial state, to be no events and blank. And then there's some other stuff in here. I won't go into all the details, but here's the big thing is, so at some point I'm going to call get speaker events right here. So I'm going to say, go ahead and get the speaker event. So it's going to basically call the service depending on what I chose, whether I chose REST or the other. So it's going to go out and call the speaker events, put them into my data, and then return that data. When it returns the data, then it's going to set the state with the new data. So that's how I get the events, and then I update the web part to do that. If you go down and look at the actual web part itself, you can kind of see how I built this. So I have the standard kind of container row column, and then I had a separate one called web row. So the web row, the first web row basically has the title of the web part on it. And then it also has the icon, the info icon that was over to the right that had some information about which data source is being used, which list is being used, that sort of stuff. So that's all in that top row. And then the next row basically says if the error message is not equal to blank, then okay, so we didn't have an error. If there is an error, if the error message is not blank, then go ahead and display this. So it's going to basically just display the error message. So you can see that I'm using the curly brace, and then I'm using just standard, JavaScript or TypeScript logic. So I put in a Boolean expression. Question mark says do the following if it's true, and then the colon says do the following if it's not true. And so it kind of nests. Okay, so if it's not true, then check to see if the title's there. So if it has a title, then that's great. And otherwise, I get that placeholder, which I imported straight from PNP, that says configure web part. So that's all I did. All I had to do is import this and stick it on the page and put in a couple of properties. The display mode, it checks to see if it's in read mode, then it hides the button. If it's in edit mode, then it puts the button there so you can open the property pane. And then once you click the button, it opens the property pane. And then basically it starts looking for the number of events. If there's more than one event, then it starts displaying the events. If there's not, then it basically displays nothing if there's no events available. So you kind of see the flow of how the React piece works. So, but it's pretty straightforward. I mean, it's not that much more complicated than the Hello World web part that we were looking at. So there's just more pieces to it. With that, I think I'll stop and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yeah.
So you've deployed your web part and it's in use on various pages and it's been customized by changing the properties. If you deploy and update that web part, what happens to the properties that were set on the pages it's been used?
So the properties themselves are stored in the site, in the site properties, where the web part exists. So even if you deploy a new version of the web part, it doesn't necessarily erase those. Now, if it uses different properties, it'll try and match them. But I'm trying to remember the exact way. There's a version number that you can use. So if you go back and look at in the config section, and I didn't show this, but I do this all the time anyway. So every time I deploy something into production, I always change the version number. So if you look at this basically, this was me yesterday making a couple of changes. So I haven't updated to version 1, but I always use the month, the day, and then how many times I deployed it today. So I deployed it 7 times yesterday trying to get it to work. But by changing that, you'll trigger the actual update. It'll actually say, would you like to update the all the web parts? And then if you say yes, it'll actually go in and update all the web parts that are out there. I think that's correct. There may be one other thing you have to do for that. But it doesn't lose the properties. If the properties that are set on the web part are still valid to be used on whatever the updated web part is, those are all in a property bag on the site, and it will use them.
Sure, thank you.
The only thing I've found in when you're upgrading SharePoint web parts is you have to upgrade the solution and change the version number. Make sure you wait you have to check it back in for all your other users to be able to access it, and make sure you wait for that check-in to complete before you try upgrading it. I've seen all sorts of fun and games where you go a bit too quickly and then suddenly you get an error when you try and you upgrade your SharePoint web part, and then you get an error saying can't load the web part. You're like, oh, what's happened here? And it's just that check-in bit hadn't finished, whatever it's doing.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. Yeah, we didn't actually show one that it was already deployed. We only deployed the one new one, so you didn't get that. But yeah, absolutely, you get that, and that's one of the reasons I really am hard on making sure you change the version number, because sometimes, and the thing is that if you drop a new one on there, whether it's got a new version number or not, it'll say, hey, this web part exists. Do you want to update it? And you say yes. And then you should get the same trust box. You should get that trust box every time you deploy the web part. If you don't, it didn't get deployed. So you need to get the trust box, answer the questions on there. And then, like Simon said, if this is an existing web part, it will check the web part out so that you see the checked out version, but your users won't see it until you check it in. So, so you'll get the, well, I already stopped sharing, but in the app catalog, you'll get the standard checkout arrow on your web part that says this has been checked out. But it will cause issues, yeah, because you'll get people going, I can't see the changes, and then you end up in this weird flux. So I think valuable. I mean, is it off-putting? Is it encouraging? Is it? I mean, I'm not going to lie and say it's a cakewalk. It's a process. But if you've been doing other development, it's just different flavor of the same thing. It's just you're using different tools, but the process of developing is still the same.
I think some of the challenges is every time you sort of spin up the tools, there's something new that's been added, and you'll get a new linting tool, and it starts throwing red error messages, and you think. It's so that sometimes that can be a bit off-putting.
It can be. All those dependencies, yeah, they will lead to issues, at some point. The other thing is if you need to go back to a previous version of the SharePoint framework, because so if you go look at the samples that are out there, they're from every version. So one of the things you can do if you want to contribute is you can go in, grab a sample that's from a previous version, upgrade it to the latest versions, but sometimes we're changing versions so fast, that's almost a never-ending cycle. But if you go back to one of the previous versions, especially the prior to I think 1.9, I think it is, then you start to have dependencies on node. So if you try and use 1.9, you have to change change the version of Gulp you use. You have to change the version of other packages that won't work with that part of the project because they've all been updated, and by default it always puts the most recent one in there unless you tell it otherwise. So there's several sites out there that you can do a lookup. Just do SPFX compatibility, and it'll show you that, hey, if you want to do SharePoint on-prem, then you have to use the SharePoint framework this or lower. And then in order to do that, you need to use Gulp that's this or lower, maybe NPM needs to be this version, that sort of stuff. Pnpm definitely has some issues. I've run into that before where I've had to downgrade the version of Pnpm in order to get to work with an older version of Node. So those can be tricky going through. One of the things I would tell you, just to, again, I'll beat on the PnP drum again, is that the people you meet there are just awesome, and you can just email them, get their contact information, email them, and most of them are great about responding. Hugo Bernier and David Warner, which they're both in the SharePoint sharing is caring space. They will gladly return your call and help you out and walk you through it. So David is a consultant. Hugo was a consultant up until recently. He now works for Microsoft. So they hired him, but he's still doing all the PnP stuff. So call me, I'll help you. So there's lots of help available out there, and that PnP site is a great place to start.
Don, what are the things that you find you can't do within Framework, but you wish you could and kind of ought to be possible?
Well, the first thing that a lot of, like, if you've done SharePoint development before, the on-prem stuff, the first thing you run into is permissions, is the fact that, hey, how do I run with elevated privileges? You can't, you can't have any more permission than the user has. So if you need something, you need to do something that requires elevated permissions, then you need to go build an Azure function, or an API that you can call, and that's server-side code. That server-side code can reach in with elevated permissions using an app-only permission that has to be set up and everything, but you can't really do it from inside the framework. So that's one of the frustrations that a lot of people run into, is that, well, I want to do this, but my users don't have permissions. Like, well, then yeah, you're kind of stuck. Other than that, I think there's things you run into all the time, but you just, it's kind of like we were talking about before, where, talking about the video thing, 90% of what you want to do is there, but for whatever reason, clients always think the other 10% is the most important thing in the world.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of capability there, but it's like the stuff you find that's not available, all of a sudden that just seems to be the most important thing that you're trying to solve. But it's getting better. There's so much stuff that you can do now that you didn't used to be able to do. So in between Microsoft and the community efforts that are going on, you're talking about Microsoft releasing stuff before it was really quite ready, whatever. Sometimes I think that's what they're doing. I go and look at some of the PnP samples for web parts specifically, and look at property pane controls and stuff, and go, oh, wait a minute, we don't need that anymore. Microsoft eventually took that and put it into the product, and so so it's the same. So sometimes I think they use us, they use the community to kind of fast track their own development, which I honestly doesn't bother me at all. I've gone through the code that these guys write in expert developers in the code that, I read a lot of their code and go, wow, okay, I've been doing this a while, but I didn't think about doing it that way. Yep, that's really slick. They were able to do it. So someone had a hand up.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, it's me, Stuart. Yeah, hi. Can everybody hear me? I'm just on a Bluetooth headset. Yeah. I've never really done any SharePoint development, but I'm doing a lot of stuff at the moment with Power Apps and Power Automate, and that gets repeating tables, repeating sections. I find even that gets a little bit hairy for me, and quite heavy going, and I think. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you kind of don't know how long something's going to take you, or how complex it's going to be, until you set off down the road. So this I guess, how do you know what's possible, or how long it's going to take you, or is it just a journey you set off on, and it just happens when it happens, as it happens, and do you end up just finding it's often a dead end, and you can't quite achieve what you're trying to achieve, or all that past, or is it that all that past development experience still comes in, and you always find a way of doing it somehow.
Yeah, I mean, it helps, but I completely understand. I mean, I do some Power Apps and Power Automate. I get frustrated very quickly because they're very limiting, you know, kind of, and it's like where I go, I recently did a Power Automate flow, and I'm like, you know, I spent 3 or 4 days building this thing out. And I'm like going, I could have written the whole thing in TypeScript in about 2.5 hours, you know, just because it's just, you know, that just the way it works, and it's slow. And so yeah, some of that just comes with experience, but it's going to happen. There is no way around it. One of the things I will say that I'm watching, I can't say that I've seen anything that directly says they're going to do this, but you're seeing more and more stuff, especially with Power Automate or Power Apps, where I think you're going to eventually be able to put SharePoint Framework solutions into your Power Apps. And which, if there was more of a coding opportunity inside Power Apps, I think that would just really take it to the next level. Because it wouldn't frustrate people like me. I could be like, okay, it won't do this, but you know what? I can go write, you know, 75 lines of code over here of TypeScript or JavaScript or whatever to get around that limitation if it will let me do it. So it's slowly but surely, you know, the whole, what did they call it? The something effects, the new language or whatever, which
Power effects.
Yeah, Power Effects is like, oh, here we go, this is it. And then it's like, well, no, not really. It's, you know, it's better, but it's really not code yet. We're not quite there yet. But you know, so yeah, it can be frustrating. I certainly feel that, and you know, the same thing happens, you know, in SharePoint Framework, you know, but honestly, some of the projects I've worked on lately, I've hit some walls that I thought I was like, oh, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. And I reach out, you know, and I have access not just to the PNP. The guy I reach out to is a PNP guy, but through the MVP world. And you know, he's like, oh, well, let's go look this, you know. And sure enough, we sit down for about 2 hours and pound on it, and we find a solution for it. So he's more than happy. You know, he's a coworker, so that's all help. But more than happy to contribute their time to help people solve things. Because again, you know, if you've been developing very long, I mean, I tell people, to me, development is just puzzles. It's just, you know, there's a puzzle there, and I got to figure out how to make, you know, to solve the puzzle. You know, sometimes I have limited tools. Sometimes I have a saw, and I can cut the end of that piece off to make it fit. So, you know, just make it work.
It is about practice, though, isn't it? The more you do it, the more you kind of learn how long things take, and you know, and one thing I say to my team is just write down what you've learned. You know, make sure you put them somewhere, put it in OneNote, put it in something, and just write it down, because then you can come back to it. Because yeah, we only have a limited capacity for remembering what we know, so just write it down. And then
start a blog. I mean, honestly, most of the people I know, they have a blog, including myself. You know, it's there primarily for me to document things that I learned, so that when later on I go, oh wait, how did I do that? Oh yeah, it's back here in my blog. So, but yeah, absolutely. And I actually, as I got back into my recent, you know, the job I just got a few months ago, you know, I told them, I said, my previous job, I didn't do a lot of SharePoint Framework development. They hired me to do that. We just never got to the point where I was really doing it, because we were stuck in the migration phase. But I told him, I said, you know, I know all this stuff. I just don't have the experience, and the experience of doing it over and over is so valuable, you know. So just it only takes a couple of times to do it, and it's like, oh yeah, I got that. You know, I know how to do that. It's like, you know, you want to know where to find all the nav nodes. I know where all those are now, because we, you know, spent time searching. So some of them are easy, some of them are not easy. So, but there's little tricks you can use. And some of these guys have been doing it for a long time. They have all kinds of tricks. So just inspecting REST calls, and, you know, finding, you know, the key to get the footer nodes off of the site, you know, because it doesn't seem to be documented anywhere, you know, because I keep looking for it. Even after I knew how to do it, I looked for it, and I couldn't find documentation. So yeah, that's really valuable. Just, you know, just dig in and do it. And like everything else, it's like, find a project and make yourself do it. You know, the demo projects and stuff. That's why I kind of show that project that I use for my workshop, because my goal is, I don't want to just do a demo thing. You know, I want it to be where we really build code. We really use all the tools that we're talking about to actually build something, even if it's not something that's all that valuable. It's the process. So, because I mean, how many demos have we seen? And it's like, oh yeah, that looks easy. And then you build a demo, and the first thing you try and do that's not in the demo, yeah, you can't do it.
Mhm.
You know, they were in that box for a reason.
I was intrigued when you talked about putting the manifest file in the app catalog and keeping the payload, as it were, outside. Can you talk about the reasons why that would be a good idea again? I was just intrigued about that idea.
So again, back, I don't remember how far back. I mean, a couple of years ago, that's the way it all was done. So you literally had to have a website somewhere else that hosted your code, or you could use Azure Function. There was lots of places you could put your code, and then all that got deployed was just the manifest.
Yeah,
but then they changed it because we were like, why can't we just put it in SharePoint? And you could literally take your code, put it into a SharePoint library. You just had to point to the library. So we just said, why don't you guys do it for us and make that the default? So they did. So that's become kind of the normal. And talking to this friend of mine that like I said, is working on this product. This is the first one I saw that really was trying to pull it back out. And it was just for the simplicity. If you've got, especially a commercial product that you sold to clients, and there's hundreds or thousands of these web parts that are out there somewhere. And again, you either find a bug or you want to, increase the capabilities without going maybe a full version kind of thing, but you just want to kind of make things a little bit better. Having all the code in one spot, and he takes care of versioning and all that stuff. It's a lot more complicated than it just throw it into a blob storage somewhere. He does a lot of work on making it all clean up. But the bottom line is it's almost transparent to the users. So all of a sudden, this new capability shows. It's kind of like Teams, right? Every day you open up Teams, something new shows up.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, obviously you're going to have a nightmare with caching, aren't you? So you have to make sure that the code changes actually get pulled down and there's no dependencies, etc.
We were talking about it this morning. I had a call with him this morning. We were talking about it, and he said, yeah. And it's weird because he does use caching, and he does use CDNs. And he said, and for the most part, the solution he's built works. He says, but every so often, some weird version just shows up, and he's like, I don't know where that came from, because I flushed the CDN and everything else, and all of a sudden, some browser cached it, from 6 months ago, and it used it again. So, but yeah, that's the main one that I've seen. I mean, technically, if you deploy the code with the web part, someone would have to deconstruct it, because if it's minified, what minified files look like. But your code is there, your IP is there, intellectual property is there. If they deconstruct it as to how you did it, that would be really complex to do. So if you were worried about that kind of stuff and you wanted to keep that code somewhere else, it's still going to be in the browser. I mean, it's not. Yeah. It's not like it's secure. It's more secure than it would be the other way, but it's that what is it? Security by
obfuscation.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. And so it's not really secure. It's just kind of hard to get to.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I was just fascinated with some of the issues with CDNs and putting code out to the edge and things like that. We've got a scenario where the SharePoint data resides in UK South data center, but the consumers of it are all over the world. So obviously, as much stuff in the CDN makes a difference, because that way the code is as close to the users as possible. It's only the data that needs to do that big round trip from UK South.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in fact, I don't know if when I had my screen up, I was having a bug yesterday that I was having trouble, and I thought it had something to do with the CDN. So I turned the CDN off in my dev tenant. But yeah, using the Office 365 CDN, it's free. It comes with it, kind of deal. So that's definitely a great way to start. As long as you go through all the security stuff and making sure that I have a client right now that they're like, well, we don't want to cache images, because we don't. Someone may put intellectual property in an image, kind of thing. It's like, well, that's up to you. I'm not forcing you to do anything, Here's the pros and cons, and for the most part, it's not like it's really slow if you're in the decent part of the world with decent internet connections. Even doing the full round trip is not horrible. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Has anybody got anything else, or shall we let everyone go about the rest of their remaining day?
Well, I
Okay.
appreciate the opportunity. I mean, I love talking to you guys. You guys are easy to talk to. So.
Thanks, Don.
Thank you.
So I had a whole spiel that I was going to start off. It's like, I don't understand why you guys asked for this. I said, you guys got some really expert SharePoint framework guys, but I'm guessing that no one can dumb it down enough for Simon to understand it. So you guys call me and see if I can do it.
That's very true. I mean, for my part, I'm never going to become a dev. My development days died with poking assembler. So that was a while ago. So, but for me, it's really important to understand how complicated or otherwise some of the development activities are. So when people ask me, I should be, compromise or should be a bit built as an SPFX part, at least I can give them a bit of guidance.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you've told me it's really easy, and you can knock it off in a couple of minutes. That's great.
That's it.
So I can sell that now.
Pretty near half an hour. You can have it all done in half an hour.
He told us it was easier than Power Apps, actually.
He did say that.
Yeah.
It's easier for me.
Easier for you. Yeah.
Cool. Right. So next time, as we said at the beginning, we've got Ryan. I think when it comes to just for anyone that hasn't been with us for a few sessions, we're going back to this monthly cadence because we're all getting really tired doing it every other week. So a monthly cadence, we've got something lined up for November. December, we're going to try and do our usual thing of go and catch some actual drinks together in real people, almost certainly in Leeds. So Don, if you want to come across for that, that'd be great. You'd be welcome.
Absolutely love to. So I'm running short on vacation time. We're doing 2 weeks in Italy in November. We're going to do a cruise, and so. And then I got another week scheduled in January in Puerto Vallarta. So it's like I got a new job, so I don't have any vacation time. So I'm going to be in the hole. So I'm going to be fighting back out.
When you get to Mexico, will you say hi to my little sister because she lives in Puerto Vallarta?
Oh, cool. So was she affected by? They had a lot of flooding down there, and it was kind of related to one of the storms that went through, but not directly. So they got so much rain that the dam broke or something because. Man, they had mud everywhere. It was, it was bad. I know for a while. So
it was horrible. But we haven't seen her for several years. Obviously, with COVID, she's been trapped there. We've been trapped here. So, yeah.
Yeah, we saw video.
Maybe I'll get over for Christmas.
Yeah, we saw video of a bridge that we walk back and forth across all the time. We watched the whole thing just wash out. With it, like I said, it was like a dam up in the mountains. Like so much rain, it broke, and so all this water just deluged all the way down to the beach.
Yeah, for those that don't know, it's a seaside town, but the town centre was flooded and mud bound for about 3 weeks after this. So
wow,
it's quite an unusual occurrence.
Yeah, we say
if you're a tourist town,
for that. Yeah.
Sorry, Dylan.
I was going to say, if you're a tourist town, that's not a good event.
No, but apparently the bars on the seafront were open quite quickly. So, obviously they have their priorities sorted.
Yeah.
That's where we got all our updates. So we're friends with one of the bar owners that are right down there in that area. And so they were sending updates. And so they showed the pictures of the mud and then the cleanup. But they were like, yeah, their bar's elevated a little bit. So it didn't actually get in the bar, but yeah, they were open. Within a couple of days, they were open again and ready to go. So,
yeah.
Right. I think all that's left is for everyone to thank Don very much for that.
Mm-hmm.
It was bloody good, as we would expect.
Thank you.
And we'll look forward to seeing you Tuesday in November.
Oh, last thing. Anybody want any topics for us to find? Anybody to talk about anything? Then please, reach out via Meetup or mention it now. We're always looking for inspiration on what people want to hear about. So
I think the January session is Viva Connections 101, isn't it? I think that was a good.
Okay.
Give me the date.
I may come back to
Tuesday.
that because I'm still trying to figure out Viva connection or Viva in general. So to me, it still seems like a lot of marketing.
Yeah,
It'll
well
be the
done.
third
You've just summed it
Tuesday,
up.
18th.
18th.
Should probably take a look at Stream as well, because they might have actually finished messing around with it. Stream having fully migrated to being a first-class citizen of SharePoint at that point.
That would be interesting. I tried to have a look at it a couple of weeks ago for the client that was asking me about it, and but my tenant hasn't shifted over to new Stream yet, so you can't test any of the stuff. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a
I-
whole lot there, but you've actually got governance now with Stream, which you didn't have before. And
But there are some things which have gone, which is problematic.
Yeah. A fun fact for you, that the Adelphi, where we normally are, was the first film, the first movie in the world was actually shot off that bridge just outside. So we have deep connections into video.
You might have to do Stream in January. I'm training 8 a.m. till 8 p.m. that week. I've got an extended hours course.
Wow, that's pretty tiring.
Microsoft 365 security, MS500 for those in the know.
Wow. I've just sent a link to the definitive classic versus less classic Stream guide for those that want to have a look.
And you can get the new Stream even if your link goes to the old Stream. If you go to stream.office.com, it'll take you to the new Stream even if you've got the classic Stream in your tenant still. I think that's the one. Yeah, stream.office.com will take you to the new Stream.
So that makes it look like the Stream Classic is dead, doesn't it? But the reality is Stream Classic is still out there and people have still got content in there.
Yes.
And there is currently no migration path advertised, but there will be.
That's right. Yeah.
So.
Okay.
Simons,
Yes.
I'll drop you. Sorry, I'll drop you a message about Viva connections.
Terrific. Yeah.
Potentially.
No pressure.
No.
Lovely.
None whatsoever.
Okay. Let's call it in. Thank you very much, everybody, and a special thanks to you again, Don. I look forward to seeing you in 22 one way or another. You know, you'll get here, we'll get to you. One of those two things are going to happen.
Yep, it's gonna happen.
Definitely.
Cool.
Cheers. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye now.